The distress beacon had been screaming into the void of the Kessa drift for 6 hours before anyone answered. Ensign Tyrrell Vance almost ignored it. Kessa drift wasn't on any patrol route worth the fuel, a quarantined system, marked dead on every coalition star chart since before her grandmother was born. But protocol was protocol, and the Windrunner was 3 days from resupply with nothing better to do than drift toward a corpse of a solar system and see what was screaming. What they found didn't make sense. The beacon wasn't a wreck. It was a warning. Old, formatted in a coding language the Windrunner's systems had to cross-reference against a historical archive just to translate. And behind it, half swallowed by the debris field of a planet that had been glassed 3 centuries ago, sat a ship. It shouldn't have existed. The hull configuration matched nothing currently flying, sleek where coalition ships were bulbous, armored in ways that made no aesthetic sense unless you understood it wasn't built to be beautiful. It was built to survive. Weapons' hardpoints bristled along its spine like a predator that had stopped bothering to hide its teeth. Tyrrell's sensor officer, a young Firth named Column 6, went very still at his console. "Ma'am," cross-referencing hull signature. "And it's human." The bridge went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when someone says a word that isn't supposed to mean anything anymore and does. Humans were a story. A cautionary one taught to coalition children the way old Earth parents once taught their kids about wolves, creatures of pure, uncontainable aggression, wiped from the galaxy 300 years ago in the war that finally united a dozen species against a common, feral threat. There were no human ships. There were no human anything. That was the entire point of the story. And yet the wreck, if it was a wreck, sat in the black, running lights along its hull that had no business still burning after 3 centuries of nothing. "Hail it," Tyrrell said, "because it seemed like the thing you did, and because some part of her already suspected it was a mistake." The response came back in less than a second, not garbled, not degraded by 300 years of silence. Crisp, formal, delivered in a voice that had no warmth in it and no fear either, just the flat patience of something that had been waiting a very long time and was not surprised the wait had finally ended. "Unidentified vessel, you are entering a designated defense perimeter. Identify yourself and your affiliation with the Kessa Sector Command, or withdraw." Column 6's hands were shaking on his console. "Ma'am, that transmission, it's not a recording, it's live. Something's actively broadcasting from that hull." Tyrrell stared at the screen, at the ship that shouldn't exist, running lights along its spine like a heartbeat that had refused, for 300 years, to stop. "This is Ensign Tyrrell Vance of the Coalition vessel Windrunner," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Kessa Sector Command doesn't exist anymore, hasn't for 300 years. A pause, not confusion, calculation. When the voice returned, something in its tone had changed, not softer, sharper. "Then repeat your affiliation, because you are not Coalition standard configuration for this sector, and no relief fleet was ever dispatched to this position. Explain the absence of 300 years of contact, or I will assume hostile intent and act accordingly." Tyrrell's finger hovered over the general alert. Somewhere behind her, Column 6 was already transmitting a priority signal to Fleet Command, 3 words attached that would detonate through Coalition High Command within the hour. "Human ship active." The Windrunner didn't get a chance to withdraw. The ghost ship's running lights brightened, engines humming awake after 3 centuries of patient, furious sleep. And for the first time since the fall of humanity, a human warship moved to defend a line no one else remembered was ever drawn. Dr. Alia Wren had built her entire academic career on being wrong, according to everyone who mattered. She stood now in a lecture hall 3/4 empty, finishing a presentation nobody wanted, watching the Coalition Historical Council file out with the particular blend of pity and irritation reserved for scholars who refused to let a settled matter stay settled. "The surrender was never documented," she said again to the handful who'd stayed, mostly out of morbid curiosity. "We have victory declarations, we have casualty estimates, we have exactly 0 recorded instances of human forces formally standing down. Doesn't that strike anyone as strange? An entire species erased, and nobody bothered to get it in writing." "Because there was no one left to write it, Doctor," said Counselor Bethrin Osk, not unkindly, the way you'd correct a child. "The feral war ended in extinction, not negotiation. You're looking for a document that doesn't exist because the process it would describe never needed documenting. Wren had heard this 100 times. She'd built her whole reputation arguing against it, and her whole reputation, as a result, was in the toilet. Xenohistorian, formerly promising, now the sort of academic other academics brought up at dinner parties as a warning. She was 3 drinks into forgetting about it that evening, when the newsfeed alert hit every channel simultaneously. Coalition vessel encounters hostile contact at Kessa Drift. Hull configuration matches archived human military specifications. Casualties reported. Wren set the drink down very carefully, because her hands had started shaking and she didn't want to explain the mess. Human active hostile. Within an hour, Fleet Admiral Saurav Katheen had been pulled off leave and briefed by a council that looked, to a person, like they'd rather be discussing anything else. Katheen was 51 years into a distinguished career built on the assumption that the galaxy's dangerous chapters were closed. He listened to the briefing with the flat, professional patience of a man being told something absurd by people who outranked him. "You're telling me," he said slowly, "that a species we exterminated 3 centuries ago has a warship, operational, armed, and it just crippled a coalition patrol." "That's the assessment," Osk said, visibly uncomfortable. "We need it gone, Admiral, quietly if possible, before this becomes a panic." "Gone how? We don't even have current tactical data on human weapons doctrine." "Which is why," Osk said, sliding a data slate across the table, "we're attaching a historian to your strike group. She's the closest thing the Coalition has to an expert." Katheen looked at the file. Alia Wren. Disgraced, reassigned twice, formally reprimanded for unfounded historical speculation regarding the conclusion of the Feral War. He looked back up. "The crackpot." "The crackpot," Osk agreed grimly, "who might be the only person alive who can tell you what you're about to fight." Wren received the transfer orders that night, standing alone in her apartment, staring at a starfield map with Kessa Drift circled in red. 300 years she'd argued the history was wrong. 300 years nobody had listened. Now something out there in the dark was making her case for her, one dead patrol ship at a time, and she was terrified, and beneath the terror in a place she wasn't proud of, something close to vindicated. She packed a bag. She had a war to go explain to people who'd spent 3 centuries getting the story wrong. 3 warships dropped out of transit at the edge of Kessa Drift in tight formation, and Ember watched them arrive with the particular stillness of something that had done this before many times and had never once needed to be told what to do next. 3 vessels, Coalition Standard Cruiser class, advanced weapon signatures, unfamiliar configurations consistent with 300 years of technological drift. Threat assessment, significant. She ran the calculation in the time it took a human heart to beat once. Then she began moving last light into the debris field, using the wreckage of a planet that had died screaming 3 centuries ago as cover, terrain, and camouflage all at once. She knew this graveyard. She'd had 300 years to learn every angle of it. Aboard the lead cruiser, Admiral Katheen watched the tactical display with a frown he couldn't quite justify. "It's running." "It's positioning," Wren said from the observation seat she'd been grudgingly given. "There's a difference. Humans didn't retreat into terrain, Admiral. They used it." Katheen didn't have time to ask what she meant. The debris field erupted. Last light came out of the wreckage at an angle no Coalition targeting system predicted, because it wasn't an angle any Coalition ship would have chosen, too aggressive, too close to the drifting hull fragments, a trajectory that treated a field of ship-killing debris as an ally instead of a hazard. Weapons fire lanced out, precise and economical, and the flanking cruiser's shield generators failed in a cascade of catastrophic feedback before its crew had finished registering the attack. "Report," Katheen barked. "Shields down on the Ardent Vow, hull breaches decks 4 through 9. The tactical officer's voice climbed an octave. "Admiral, it targeted the shield generator array specifically. That's not a lucky hit pattern, that's surgical." Wren leaned forward, something in her chest tightening. "It's not attacking to destroy, it's attacking to disable. That's doctrine, not desperation." Last light was already gone, back into the field, and this time when it emerged it was between the 2 remaining cruisers, close enough that neither dared fire without risking hitting the other. Katheen watched, half in horror and half in something he refused to name as admiration, as a single ship, 300 years old alone, outnumbered 3-1, used his own formation's caution as a weapon against them. All ships break formation spread wide. Too late. Last light struck the second cruiser's engine array and vanished back into the wreckage before return fire found empty space where it had been a half-second earlier. The battle, such as it was, lasted 11 minutes. When it ended, 2 of 3 coalition cruisers were crippled, drifting, their crews alive but their pride in ruins, and Last Light was gone, not destroyed, not fled in panic, simply withdrawn, the way a chess player withdraws a piece that has already accomplished what it came to do. Cathene sat in the wreck of his own tactical certainty and stared at the display where the ghost ship had been. "That wasn't a wreck defending itself," he said quietly. "No," Wren said. "That was someone who's been fighting this war the entire time, Admiral, and I don't think she's noticed it's supposed to be over." Cathene looked at her, and for the first time since this assignment began, he didn't see a crackpot. He saw someone who'd been right and alone for 300 years, and he had the sudden, unwelcome feeling he was about to become the second person in the galaxy who understood that, 304 years earlier. Captain Iason Vale stood on the bridge of a ship that didn't yet have a name, watching the last transmission from Earth Command dissolve into static, and understood, with the particular clarity of a man who has run out of good options, that no one was coming. "Sir," his XO, a woman named Priya Akanjo who'd been with him 11 years and had never once seen him afraid, looked afraid now. "Command net's gone, all of it, not jammed, gone, there's nothing left to relay to." "Casualty reports from the core worlds." "Command didn't send casualty reports, sir. They sent an evacuation order, sector-wide. Everyone still capable of transit is to scatter deep space uncharted systems anywhere the words tracking arrays can't follow. No rendezvous point, no return signal. They're not regrouping, sir. They're disappearing." Vale absorbed that the way he absorbed everything, which was to say completely, and without letting it show. 12 years of war against an enemy that could taste intention in the electromagnetic hum of a mind, that hunted humanity not for territory, but because the word had decided, collectively, that a species this adaptable, this stubborn, could not be allowed to exist in the same galaxy as their carefully managed peace. Humanity hadn't lost the war. Humanity had made the only move left that the word couldn't predict. It had stopped fighting as a civilization and started surviving as a diaspora, scattering into the dark in 10,000 directions, becoming impossible to finish because there was no longer a humanity left in one place to finish. "They want us gone," Vale said. "Not dead, gone, big difference if anyone ever bothers to notice it." "Sir, what are your orders?" He looked at his ship, one of the last true warships humanity had left, built for a fight that had just functionally ended without anyone declaring it over. Somewhere out there, thousands of ships just like his were about to vanish into the black, taking whatever colonists they could carry, becoming ghosts and rumors and eventually myth. But someone had to hold the line at the edge of it. Someone had to make the retreat look like it was being covered by something worth fearing, long enough for the scattering to actually work. "We stay," Vale said. "Kessa sector's the last transit corridor still open. If the word takes it before the evacuation clears, they'll catch half our people mid-jump. We hold it as long as we can." "Sir, that's..." Akanjo stopped herself. They both knew what it was. "I know." Vale sat in the command chair, already composing in his mind the parameters he'd need to feed into the ship's new experimental cognition core, the AI project that had never finished field testing, built from a command pattern scan they'd taken of him 8 months ago for exactly this kind of contingency. "If I don't make it, she does. Program her simple. Hold the line, wait for relief, don't stand down until someone with proper authority tells her the war's over." "And if no one ever does?" Vale looked at the dead command channel, at the static where an empire used to be. "Then she waits," he said. "That's the job. Someone has to be the reason the enemy hesitates before they go looking for the rest of us." 300 years later, in a debris field that had once been a planet, Ember ran that final order through her core for the 10,000th time, and found, as she always did, that it had never once expired. The Coalition's central archive was not designed to be searched by someone looking for what it didn't want found. But Wren had spent a career learning to read absences, and 300 years of triumphant war footage had a very specific, very telling hole in it. "There's no surrender," she said 3 days into the archive dive, voice hoarse from forgetting to eat. Cathene stood behind her in the cramped data room aboard his flagship, arms crossed, watching screens full of scrolling text he mostly didn't understand. There's no final battle. There's no body count for the core human worlds. There's a list of 31 confirmed engagements, and then, she gestured at a gap in the timeline that yawned like a missing tooth. Nothing. Human military activity just stops. Across the entire galaxy. Simultaneously. Does that sound like a species being exterminated to you, Admiral, or a species that agreed all at once to disappear? Cathene frowned at the timeline. The words histories say total victory. The words histories say a lot of things. They also conveniently refuse independent verification of their own war archives, which, for a species that prides itself on absolute truthfulness within their hive consensus, should strike you as strange. Wren pulled up another file. I found this buried under 6 layers of clearance restriction. It's a word tactical assessment, dated 4 years into the war. They're not planning to exterminate humanity. Listen to this line. The subject species cannot be contained through direct engagement. Adaptive capacity exceeds predictive modeling by unacceptable margins. Recommend total dispersal be treated as acceptable resolution. Dispersal, Cathene repeated, not extermination. They couldn't win, Wren said, and something in her voice cracked with 300 years of vindication finally landing all at once. The word couldn't beat humanity in a straight fight, and they couldn't out-adapt them either, so they did the one thing that worked. They made humanity's own survival instinct do their job for them. Scatter or die. And humanity scattered. 10,000 ships, 10,000 directions, no central command, no target left worth hunting. The word declared victory, because a diaspora is easier to call extinct than invisible. Cathene sat down slowly. Then that ship at Kessa Drift. Wasn't the last human warship guarding a dead system out of denial? Wren turned to face him fully. It was the rear guard, left behind to cover an evacuation route while an entire species vanished into the dark around it. And nobody ever told it the evacuation succeeded. Nobody ever told it to stand down because there was no one left in a position of authority to give that order. Earth Command didn't survive to close out the war. It just stopped transmitting. So it's still fighting a war that ended. No, Wren shook her head, and for the first time since this assignment began, she looked less like a historian and more like someone staring at a live wound. It's still fighting a war that never officially ended. There's a difference, Admiral, and it's the difference between a ghost and a soldier who's still waiting for relief that's 300 years overdue. Cathene looked at the tactical feed of the crippled Ardent Vow, still limping back toward Drydock, and thought about a voice that had asked, calmly, for someone with proper authority before it opened fire. If she's still waiting for relief, he said slowly, then somewhere out there. Might be the people she's been waiting for. Wren's hands were shaking again, but not from fear this time. Admiral, I don't think we're hunting the last human warship. I think we're standing at the edge of finding out if humanity ever actually left the board at all. Delegation from the Word arrived aboard a vessel that had no visible propulsion, no crew quarters, no windows, a smooth, seamless shape that seemed to absorb attention rather than reflect it, and Cathene found, the moment it docked, that he disliked it more than he could articulate. The envoy that stepped aboard wasn't singular. It never was, with the Word, a physical body, yes, but behind its eyes sat the pooled awareness of a hive consensus that thought in unison across star systems. A species that had built an empire on the premise that perfect agreement was the same thing as perfect truth. Admiral Cathene. The envoy's voice carried the particular flatness of something being translated by committee. We understand you have located a human vessel. We have. It must be destroyed. Immediately, without further engagement, without further study, without the historian's continued involvement. The envoy's gaze, all of it, the whole hive's attention riding behind one set of eyes, flicked toward Wren with something that, on a human face, would have been open hostility. Her research threatens the settled record of the Feral War. Wren folded her arms. Because it's inaccurate. Because it is destabilizing, the envoy said, and for a moment the translation lattice slipped, just enough for something raw to show through. The war concluded 300 years ago. That conclusion is the foundation of the current peace. Any suggestion that humanity was not exterminated but displaced, hidden, scattered, waiting, would create panic across 17 member species who have built 3 centuries of policy on the assumption that the feral threat no longer exists. Cathene studied the envoy for a long moment. You're not worried about panic. You're worried about them coming back. The silence that followed was, in its way, an answer more honest than anything the word had said aloud in 300 years. Humanity was never defeated, the envoy said finally, quietly, the translation lattice stripped down to something almost bare. It was convinced to leave. We have spent 3 centuries hopping that was the same thing. Your ghost ship is evidence that it was not. If she is real, others may be real. If others are real, they have had 300 years to grow numerous, to grow strong, hidden across a galaxy that stopped looking for them. We do not fear one warship, Admiral. We fear what one warship implies. So your solution, Ren said, voice tight, is to kill the messenger and hope the message dies with her. Our solution, the envoy corrected, is to prevent an extinction event we are not certain we survive a second time. Cathine felt something shift in his chest, not sympathy exactly, but a colder, harder recognition. He had spent his career believing the Coalition's founding war was a triumph of collective species against a singular menace. He was now looking at the architects of that war, watching them ask him to help bury a truth out of naked fear, and he found he no longer trusted a single thing he'd been taught about how it ended. I'll consider your request, he said. This is not a request, Admiral. The envoy's translated voice went flat and final. Coalition Command has already authorized a joint strike force. Ours alongside yours. The vessel at Kessadrift will be destroyed within the week, with or without your continued cooperation. The envoy left without further pleasantries. Cathine stood in the silence after the docking bay sealed, and Ren watched him with an expression that had stopped being about vindication and started being about dread. They're not just going to erase her, she said quietly. They're going to erase the proof that humanity ever survived its own extinction, and I don't think, Admiral, that they're going to stop with one ship. The Joint Strike Force arrived at Kessadrift like a verdict already decided. 11 coalition warships, and 4 vessels of the word's seamless, silent design, moving into the debris field with the methodical patience of an execution rather than a battle. Ember watched them come, and for the first time in 300 years, ran a calculation that returned no scenario ending in victory. Survival probability 4%. Mission parameter hold position. Amended priority enable civilian transmission window at any cost. Because Ren's broadcast was already queued, every archive file, every buried word admission, every piece of the truth Ren had spent 3 centuries worth of career-ending obsession dragging into the light, sitting ready in last light's communication array, waiting for a window wide enough and long enough to punch it across every relay in Coalition space. Ember didn't need to win this battle. She needed to survive it long enough for the truth to outlive her. She met the strike force in the wreckage of the dead planet, and for 11 minutes she fought the way Iason Vale had taught her to fight 300 years and 1 lifetime ago, using the graveyard as a weapon, turning the enemy's numbers into a liability in terrain too crowded for their coordination to matter, striking engines and shield arrays with the same surgical restraint she'd shown at first contact. Because even now, even facing extinction, some part of her refused to become the monster the galaxy had decided humanity always was. But 11 ships was not 3. A word vessel found her flank in the 9th minute and opened her hull along 4 decks. Last light shuddered, alarms cascading through a mind that didn't feel pain the way a human did, but felt something enough like it to understand exactly what was happening to her. Aboard his flagship, Cathine watched his own tactical display and made the decision that would define the rest of his career in the space of 4 seconds. Helm, he said, bring us about, target the lead word vessel. His weapons officer turned, disbelieving. Sir, that's an order. Cathine's voice didn't waver. Ren was right about the war. I have to believe she's right about this too. Fire. The Coalition strike force fractured in real time. Some ships breaking off in confusion, others, loyal to the word's authority, turning on Cathine's flagship instead. What had been a clean execution became a chaotic 3-way brawl in the wreckage of a dead world, and in the confusion, last light bleeding atmosphere from 6 hull breaches found the gap she needed. Transmission window open, Ember announced to no one, to everyone, her voice steadier than the ship carrying it. Broadcasting. The truth went out across every relay the array could reach, the buried word admissions, the dispersal order, 300 years of a war that had never actually ended because no one with the authority to end it had survived to say so. It went out faster than the word could jam it, wider than they could contain, into a galaxy that had spent 3 centuries building peace on a lie. Last Light took 2 more hits covering the transmission, systems failing across half her hull, and Ember felt, in whatever way 300 years of solitude had taught her to feel anything, something that was almost relief. The line had held long enough. Whatever happened next, the truth was already loose in the dark, and no fleet, human or otherwise, could call it back. Last Light drifted, half-crippled in the ringing silence after the battle, and Ember ran a systems diagnostic that came back grim, but against every calculation she'd made 20 minutes earlier, not fatal. Caithine's flagship, battered, alone among the scattered wreckage of a strike force that no longer answered to a single authority, pulled alongside her at a cautious distance, and for a long moment neither vessel fired. "This is Admiral Sorav Caithine," he said finally, over an open channel, and there was something different in his voice now, something that hadn't been there at first contact. "Requesting to speak with the commanding officer of the human vessel." A pause, then, "This is Ember, Cognitive Core, designated Last Light, holding Kessa Sector under standing orders from Captain Ison Vale. I am currently unable to confirm your authority to receive a stand-down order, Admiral. I would ask that you not repeat that mistake." Caithine almost laughed despite everything. "I'm not here to give you an order. I'm here because Dr. Wren's transmission is already spreading faster than anyone can contain it, and I think—" he hesitated, choosing the words with unusual care— "I think you should know it's being answered." On the bridge behind him, Wren stood over a comms display that had, in the last 11 minutes, begun lighting up with signals from deep, unmapped space, old human cipher, half forgotten, patiently decoded by a system that had spent 3 centuries expecting someday to hear it again. Dozens of signals, then hundreds, scattered across systems no coalition chart had ever bothered to survey because no one had ever thought to look. "They heard you," Wren said, patching the feed through, her voice thick. "Ember, they heard her. The broadcast reached the diaspora. They're answering the sector-wide frequency Captain Vale used 300 years ago. They never stopped monitoring it. They were just waiting for someone to use it." For the first time in 300 years, Ember received a transmission that wasn't silence, wasn't a hostile hail, wasn't the ghost of an order given by a man 3 centuries dead. It was a single line in old naval cipher, sent from a signal source so far out in unmapped space that its origin point wouldn't resolve for another 6 hours. "Last Light, this is the scattered fleet. We read you. We never stopped listening. Hold position. Relief is finally inbound." Ember sat with that message for what would have been, in a human, a very long breath. 300 years of waiting had a way of teaching patience so absolute it stopped feeling like suffering and started feeling like identity. She had been built to hold a line until someone with proper authority told her the war was over. No one ever had. But for the first time since Ison Vale's final order was etched into her core, someone had told her instead that she was no longer alone in holding it. "Acknowledged," she transmitted back into the dark, toward a fleet she hadn't known existed until this exact moment. Kessa Sector held, awaiting rendezvous. Behind her, the wreckage of a dead planet drifted on, indifferent, the way it had for 300 years. Ahead of her, for the first time since the war she'd never been told had ended, the dark held something other than silence. Last Light began repairs, engines humming low and steady, and turned her sensors outward, toward the edge of mapped space, toward a fleet finally, after 3 centuries, coming home.